Apparently now we're recording and we weren't recording before. Anyway, welcome to Huddle, and here we go. Today's Huddle, we're going to talk about all things earnest money and earnest money related topics. We're going to go through every form that I could find regarding earnest money and how important it is. We're also going to review some stuff from the REPC and talk about that. We're going to talk about the negotiation and how earnest money, in my opinion, should be at the forefront of all your thoughts in negotiations. And as usual, I hope you feel free to chime in at any moment to provide some context or comments or something else that I may be missing during this meeting. So to begin, one thing I thought I'd do is, we don't usually go over this stuff a lot, but I thought I would sort of start with some earnest money, maybe a little bit of earnest money law, as well as, you know, the brokerage's position on earnest money, which, as you might suspect, is pretty close to what the law is saying. There is a lot that surrounds earnest money, and I think let's jump first to what our brokerage's protocol is. I think that as time has gone on and as checks have become less fashionable, depositing, just the sheer act of depositing earnest money has gotten significantly easier. I think everybody is resorting to getting cashier's checks or money orders or doing wires to deposit earnest money. In the past, I think it was a much bigger problem when agents would take possession of earnest money, and I don't think we have that anymore. As a brokerage, we would prefer that our agents not handle earnest money at all. I think, if you as an agent would prefer to have that as part of your sort of operating status quo, you could just say, hey, listen, I don't take or handle earnest money. That's a totally appropriate comment to make. You're going to have to go drop that off or send a wire to our brokerage. I think that's totally fine. Scott, yes, I am going to cover that today. So we will cover earnest money deposits from other people from the other side in our brokerage today.
Mike, I learned this lesson from you probably a year or two ago that I think was great advice: is cashier's check or wire, never personal check.
Yeah. That is we as a brokerage don't restrict the check. But I think, just logistics wise, we probably should heavily lean on people to not do the check. The check is very problematic, especially considering the amounts that they usually are for these earnest money checks. I don't know how long they take to clear, but sometimes it can take quite a bit of time for this to clear. So yeah, we should avoid that at all costs. We actually had a really interesting situation. I don't know what it is with Ogden, but a couple times a year, people show up with wads of cash, even though they have been instructed multiple times not to show up with cash. We don't accept cash. But in this instance, I really wish our OA would have accepted the cash, because they showed up with $1,000 bills, which, for those of you may not even know that they once made $1,000 bills. And as you might suspect, they no longer make them, and they are a bit of a collector's item. Though they are legal tender, they are now worth about $3,500 a piece. It would have been a little slimy to take that, and sell it and, do the whole thing. But, I maybe have thought about it a little bit. Anyway, no cash. We don't do that stuff anymore.
So Mike, what is the serial number on those bills, by the way?
Oh, man, I don't know. I heard about it like a month later, and we were all like, well, what's her number? Maybe we should call and buy them off of her or something. We were tossing around ideas to get our hands on $1,000 bill. It never came to be, though.
Yeah, sorry you missed out.
Could you imagine if all our offices were depositing tens of thousands of dollars every day? We'd be a target for, a robbery. Doug asks, crypto. That's an interesting question. So far, no. I feel like I heard, during the initial crypto's the coolest thing on earth phase, the first one, I feel like there was like one transaction that took place all with crypto, and it made headlines and all that stuff. But we are, quite frankly, we're not even talking about it. But it is an interesting subject. I suspect that you could do it if, well, I don't know what the titles company's position is, but I don't see, man, maybe Rob has a perspective on this. I don't see any reason why you couldn't negotiate that. And if the seller wants to accept crypto, the seller can accept crypto, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if the contract is stating that it's there, but the only way it would work is you're sending it directly to the other party. And so you would have to, in essence, modify the contract that the earnest money in it is going to be held with the seller in their own crypto account, and you're losing a lot of control. I guess you could say if that were the case, but certainly if the parties want to do that, and now if the seller's basically got the money right out of the gate, they could certainly do it.
Hey,
I
Mike.
would say at this point I would advise against it.
Yeah, hit it, Doug.
Hey, the reason I threw that out there, you're right. There was some talk, I don't know, a couple of years ago up in the Park City office about using that as, I guess, tenure for transactions. And the concern at that time, the reason I put the little smiley face on there is, at least at that time, and I am no crypto expert, there was a concern that the value of crypto changes by the second, and one party could be on the
Yeah.
short end of that.
That's a valid piece, unless they cashed it out immediately after they got it. And so now, because what can happen is, well, there's even a cost to cash it out. But if they cashed out the money and kept it as a cash account in their own in the crypto account, you can have different levels of coin, or you can have cash value in itself. So they would almost have to cash it out, which there's a fee to do that, and they would have to negotiate who's going to eat that fee.
Yeah.
So, but that's a good point. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah, that's yeah, I haven't heard anybody that's actively, I haven't heard of anything lately regarding real estate and crypto that would, like, anything. No one's talking about it. I haven't seen any new stuff, even though crypto's still in the midst of a boom. I just don't, haven't heard a single thing. But to be official, we are not accepting crypto as earnest money deposit. Maybe we could make a headline if we decided to. I don't know. I don't know if we'd want to make a headline, but maybe we could. Yeah. So anyway, I think we as a brokerage, like, and I'll repeat this, you can go ahead and say, I don't handle earnest money. I think that's actually a pretty good thing to just stick to. We don't handle earnest money. You could send a wire. You can drop it off at our office. And you obviously can take possession of it. But if you do, just know, I mean, I think a good practice, if you are going to take possession of earnest money, I think a really good practice for you is to simply, you only take possession when you can make a straight shot right to the office to drop it off. To say, hey, listen, I'm going to pick this up on Wednesday, but I can't make it to the office till Friday. I think you're asking for trouble there. That's a bit problematic. Could it be done? Yes. Is it, in accordance with the contract? Yeah, but it's can be problematic. Not to mention that we have, we as the brokerage, so you have 4 days to collect the earnest money. Well, we as the brokerage have 4 days to, we have the brokerage have 4 days to deposit it. And these are all calendar days, right? So if they're calendar days and you give it to us Friday afternoon, well, that's just 2 days that are chewed up right there. I mean, we get it done, but no use pushing the envelope if we can just plan a little bit and make sure that gets done really well. Let's see. By the way, this is actually kind of a big issue, and I don't think a lot of agents think about this. There are times, and this happens, 5 or 6 times a year in my office, and probably more in Rob's, and definitely in Sharon's and everybody's office, where the agent just simply hasn't submitted an under contract to the office yet. Like, they haven't hit submit. The contract's been accepted, but the office isn't really aware of an under contract. And we get people that show up to our office with earnest money. And we're like, well, we can't really just take people's money. We can take people's money in accordance with a document that we have that gives us permission and states that they're giving it to us. But if we don't have that document and we don't really know what it is, you could see the problem, right? Random strangers show up to the wrong brokerage and we take their money and go, yeah, okay, well, we'll see that document eventually. We'll just deposit it for now. That's a big problem. So just be aware that, you know, your OAs, when they don't have these documents in front of them or can't reference something and see that it's under contract, they're really not supposed to take possession of this money, because, you know, it's not ours to take possession of unless we really know. So be aware of that to kind of help. And, you know, those things always clear up. It's almost, I don't know that it's ever not been under contract, or we have the documentation, but it might have taken an extra day and, you know, your client made the trip for no reason or whatever. Just know that you could solve a lot of problems by just making sure that you've submitted your documentation to us beforehand. One thing I wanted to talk about too, because we're kind of talking about protocols and laws and stuff before we jump into the REPC, disputes and release of earnest money. You know, well, you know what, this isn't a good time to talk about. We'll jump into that a little bit later, because it'll fit a little bit later in our huddle here. All right, let's here's what I want to do. I want to go over the REPC and basically chat about every single spot that earnest money is in. And you know, I don't know that I've ever done this, but because I wanted to talk about earnest money today, I decided to do it. So let's go ahead and share this, and here we go. Now, a couple of things I did find. Let's blow this up. Come on, come on. Everybody should be good seeing that, right? All right, let's just do this little experiment. Earnest money. So you could see earnest money is referenced 30 times in our purchase contract. That's quite a bit. So obviously it's important. We all understand the basics of why it's important. But let's review every single time we see earnest money. And I have a quick question on this spot, okay? Well, actually, let's just put it to the crowd. Where does it say that your earnest money is credited towards the purchase of the property? Where does it actually say that? And I looked and made sure so I wouldn't embarrass myself, but I have a feeling that I still might get embarrassed on this one. So there's your purchase contract. Where does it actually say? So we've got, I'll read the first paragraph. On this day, offer reference day, offers to purchase from the seller the property described below, and it agrees to deliver no later than 4 calendar days after acceptance of the earnest money deposited in the amount of, in the form of, after acceptance of the REPC by buyer and seller and receipt of the earnest money by the brokerage. And then the brokerage will have 4 calendar days in which to deposit earnest money into the brokerage real estate trust account. Okay, doesn't say it there. Now you go, well, of course it says it in section 2, right? Because we're accounting for all the monies that are going to be deposited. So, but let's read it in 2.18, earnest money deposit. Under certain conditions described in the REPC, this deposit may become totally non-refundable. I mean, it doesn't explicitly state it there either. It's kind of, I think it's strongly implied, but it doesn't really say it, right? And then, you know, you have an additional earnest money deposit, and then you add all that up, and then you got the purchase price total of lines A through E, right? Anybody want to guess where the one spot? Well, the one spot I found, there's probably more. We're gonna scroll. We're gonna scroll all the way. Well, let's not. We'll hit it when we get there. Buyer's right to cancel or resolve objections. If buyer determines, in buyer's sole discretion, that the results of due diligence are unacceptable, buyer may either no later than due diligence deadline, reference to section 24, cancel the REPSI by providing written notice to seller, whereupon the earnest money deposit shall be released to buyer without the requirement of further written authorization from seller. So there you go. Doesn't really say it in there. But what it does say, by the way, so when we talk about, this is the first spot where it talks about it. When we talk about releasing earnest money, there's a few, it really clearly, everywhere you read earnest money, and by the way, keep this in mind when we talk about it. When you talk about earnest money in addenda, and you're maybe adding earnest money or releasing earnest money or declaring it non-refundable, or you're adding some kind of condition, notice how it's talked about in the REPSI, right? So there's a cause and there's also a consequence when things don't go right. And so remember that when you write anything related to the earnest money deposit or something doesn't happen, like, explain it explicitly. If this happens or does not happen, this happens to the earnest money. I don't know if I said that very clearly, but that's the point. So here, it clearly, we all know this, right? If the buyer doesn't like what they see in their due diligence deadline, it just says they get their earnest money back. It's released to them and nobody gets to say anything about it, right? Without the requirement of further written authorization from seller, okay? The seller doesn't get to determine whether that happens. Failure to cancel or resolve objections. If buyer fails to cancel the REPSI or fails to resolve in writing with seller any objections buyer has arising from the due diligence, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the due diligence condition and except as provided in section 8.2, the earnest money deposit shall become non-refundable. There you go. But it doesn't say anything about, releasing it without further written authorization. It doesn't have that kind of language in there. It's different, right? Let's go down here to buyer's right to cancel. If after completion, so this is in the appraisal condition, right? If after completion of an appraisal by a licensed appraiser, buyer receives written notice from the lender of the appraiser that the property is appraised for less than the purchase price, buyer may cancel the REPSI by providing written notice to seller with a copy of the appraisal, notice of appraised value, no later than the finance and appraisal deadline referenced in section 24, whereupon the earnest money deposit shall be released to buyer without the further written authorization from seller. Again, this is like, they have the rights, they don't need anybody's permission. But while we're on this is a really interesting spot. And sometimes it's semantics, but remember, we talk about the finance and appraisal deadline as if they're a single condition, but they're not. They're two conditions. And you could argue it's semantics to say that, well, if they're saying they're canceling because of the appraisal, well, if they do say that, they need to give you a copy of the notice of appraised value in order to cancel without incurring some type of penalty. Just remember that. All right, moving on. Here's the other spot it's written. Failure to cancel. If the REPSI is not canceled as provided in section 8.2, buyer shall be deemed to have waived the appraisal condition. Earnest money deposit shall become non-refundable. Again, another spot where, but of course, it's a little different, but earnest money deposit shall become non-refundable. Let's go to financing condition. This is, we always talk about this. I think we harp on 8.3 BI quite a bit. I think for good reason. By the way, here's a question for the audience. How many people have put any amount of money or negotiated from either side? You countered for 8.3 BI or you put it in as part of a competitive offer, any money, earnest money amounts in 8.3 BI in the last 12 months. If you have, throw one in there, throw a little note in there. Let me know if you've done it, if it was successful, if it's something you would consider. I want everybody to consider this. As soon as we kind of go through all these spots, I want to talk about some strategy surrounding these things because I think it's important. So this is 8.3 BI, buyer's right to cancel before the financing and appraisal deadline. If buyer, in buyer's sole discretion, is not satisfied with the terms and condition of the loan, buyer may, after the due diligence deadline referenced in section 24B, cancel the REPC by providing written notice to seller no later than the finance and appraisal deadline referenced in section 24, whereupon this amount of money of buyer's earnest money deposit shall be released to seller without the further or without requirement of further written authorization from buyer, and the remainder of buyer's earnest money deposit shall be released to buyer without the further written authorization from seller. You can see how that can be used from both perspectives, right? If a buyer is claiming that they are ready to go and there's a little bit of competition out there and you represent the seller, you really should think about countering with this. This is sort of a really good money where your mouth is. If you're so confident in your ability to close, what does it matter if we put that in there? What does it matter if you're going to close 8.3 BI? It doesn't matter. If you close, this is an irrelevant paragraph, but it's there because people don't close. And your confidence can disappear in a matter of days about your ability to close. A lender can say, hey, by the way, that thing you gave us, it didn't turn out to be true. Can you give us another thing? And you can't give them the other thing, and all of a sudden your loan's in jeopardy. All sorts of reasons why your confidence can change. And this is a good way to keep people on track and to actually show that they do have the confidence in which they claim. All right, moving on to 8.3B, deposit release to seller. Hold on. Well, we gotta read this because I wanted to read 8.3B, I, and I. Buyer's right to cancel after the financing and appraisal deadline. If after the expiration of the finance and appraisal deadline referencing section 24C, buyer fails to obtain the loan, meaning that the proceeds of the loan had not been delivered by the lender to the escrow closing office as required in section 3.2, then buyer shall not be obligated to purchase the property, and seller may cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the other party. Rob and Sharon, let's see who else. Is there any other manager on here? I got a question for you guys because this has come up more than once. And it kind of relates to this paragraph. So what this paragraph is saying is, if the buyer can't get the loan, and we receive notice that the buyer can't get the loan, it's saying the seller can just cancel. But, what if they can't get that loan? Maybe they can get a hard money loan. Maybe they can get something else. In what scenario would you recommend that our listing agent go ahead and cancel the REPC because the buyer, maybe they have 2 months left after their finance and appraisal deadline, or not months. They got a couple weeks between the finance and appraisal deadline and say settlement. So they have some time and they're like, no, we're going to the end. So the buyer insists, we're going all the way to settlement. We're gonna try to make this happen. And the seller's like, you can't get your loan. I want to be done. What do we do here?
Yeah, my advice at that point, of course, it's a touchy scenario because what you pointed out was correct, where if the buyer was denied their loan by one institution, is it possible that they could still get financing from another avenue, whether that be a hard money loan, whether that be another traditional lender, borrowing money from friend, family, whatever. So it does create that the buyer has potential outs. I would assume that if this was occurring where the buyer provided some documentation that indicated, hey, we can no longer we're not qualified. We lost our job. We did whatever it is that's preventing us from moving forward. I would assume that the communication that was going on with the buyer's agent, whatever, indicated that they that they were done. There was no other avenue. I would certainly advise that my first avenue, if I represented the seller, okay, understand that. Will you send over a buyer's notice of cancellation, indicating that you're canceling based on financing? And then starting there, if the agent didn't want to do that, because their buyer said, hold on. That right there would be my first concern for the seller to be proactive in trying to cancel it themselves. But again, like anything else, if the seller's adamant and they're going to take the position, look, the buyer's made the uh, the evidence to support that they can't move forward. We've got another offer that we can accept. I want to move forward. I would advise my seller, hey, you might want to get some legal advice first before you do that. But according to this, it does indicate if they cannot financially meet the obligation, then the seller has the right to do it. I would just be very cautious of taking that approach.
What say you, Sharon?
I would say that without that cancellation, I don't think you better enter into another contract until the termination of that, the deadline for settlement / closing. Regardless of what happened to the earnest money, it's not a cancellation of the contract. They get the earnest money, but I would say it's not something that a seller should proceed and feel like they can cancel this contract. That's how I feel. I would never let an agent do that.
Yeah, me neither. But I have had this posed to me when I was in the position for someone to say, well, I was the broker, and someone said to our agent, hey, we want to cancel for this reason. And our agent was doing exactly as, our client was doing exactly as Rob had described, trying to scramble to find some funds to close. And they were trying to push this on us. It all ended in not a good way, but the bottom line is, yeah, I think there's some room there, and I don't think we should be advising our sellers that's what they should do. Anyway, thanks for your contributions there. Earnest money deposits released to seller. If the REPSI is canceled as provided in 8.3 BII, buyer agrees that all of the buyer's earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, shall be released to seller without the requirement or further written authorization from buyer. Seller agrees to accept as seller exclusive remedy the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, as liquidated damages. Buyer and seller agree that liquidated damages would be difficult and impractical to calculate, and the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, is a fair and reasonable estimate of seller damages in the event buyer fails to obtain a loan. I think this is a really important paragraph when you discuss earnest money and its effect on your seller, because it says it right there. When we talk about, when we represent a seller and we talk about the amount of earnest money that may be important or why it's important, just go straight to this paragraph, because it says right there that it says right there, it's almost there. It's their exclusive remedy. One, it says exclusive remedy, but it's also, forget it says that. It's really the only practical remedy on the vast majority of the transactions that take place. Yeah, there's some transactions that are really large that, maybe there's some other remedies that should be important, but practically speaking, this is really the only thing the seller will get in the event that there's a real problem. So that's not the only context in which we should discuss earnest money, but it's definitely one of them. This is a really good paragraph to read to your client over and more than once, and remind them this is your only remedy if things go bad. So if this $1,500 you don't think that that's a good enough remedy for somebody backing out right at the closing deadline, then we need to discuss a significantly higher amount. And pose the situation. What if you have all your stuff packed up and you've got it all loaded and you signed your paperwork and you're driving the car out of town and you get a message that, hey, it's closing day and they didn't show up and everything blew up and it failed, and you get their earnest money. So how much earnest money is a remedy for that problem? That's a good way to look at it. I mean, I know we don't always get to request earnest money for the amounts that might solve that problem, but that's a really good lens in which to view it, in my opinion. Scott says, if the buyer, lender, and or agent know that the buyer cannot close well before the finance deadline, is waiting until the deadline a violation? That's a really good question. It's a really good question. I think my initial answer is if all of the people involved, so the buyer, the lender, and the agent, all agree that they don't have an ability to close,
And cancellation.
then I think we have some recourse there. If they all admit it to us as a seller's agent, if we hear as a seller's agent from the other agents say, hey, we all agree that we can't close, and there's no way for them to close, but we don't like you for this reason, so we're just gonna go all the way to the settlement deadline before we cancel or be in default. Yeah, I think there's some remedies
This
there.
is, Mike, this is kind of where I was leading with it. And I have had some conversations with some attorneys about this exact same piece. I can't remember what the legal term is, but there is something with like that's implied. If there's no ability to close, and there's evidence and proof to support it, then this is where that would fall under where the buyer or seller may cancel the REPSI by providing the written notice, and it goes down that road. There isn't anywhere in the contract or any code of ethics or anything like that that says that if they can't, then they must cancel. There's nothing that says it, so there isn't a violation that it would fall under. The question comes into play is, can the seller cancel? And that goes back to what we're saying. I would advise a seller, if they were contemplating it, talk to an attorney, get their legal advice, and if that's the legal advice the attorney gives is to submit a cancellation, then according to the contract they could do it based on the buyer's inability to perform. But I would make sure that all your T's are crossed or your I's are dotted, but there's nothing that says that they're in violation of anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, Rob. I think too. I think the term that, because I was searching for a term, I was searching for it too, and the thing that popped into my mind was that they are not making a good faith effort to complete the terms of the contract. And you can't enter a contract and then just sort of ignore it and then get to enforce it later. So they're not operating in good faith, and I think you have an avenue to cancel it. But I would definitely, this is one of those things where I don't even know if anybody in our company can give the advice on how to proceed forward with that. Only our clients.
Nor would we want to.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think that is a good point, because that does happen. It absolutely happens, and there are scenarios where they just get angry and they just sort of stop communicating, and they're pouty or whatever, and we're trying to protect our client and we got to deal with it. There are avenues for that, and I think the first stop is your favorite real estate attorney. I think that's the first stop. So, good question. All right, moving on. Additional earnest money deposits. So down here, section 8.4. I think this is a really good section, and I would encourage everybody to start thinking of this. By the way, put it in the chat. How many people have actually used 8.4 in the last 12 months? It's a really good tool for you. And so let's read it. If the REPSI has not been previously canceled by the buyers provided in section 8.1, 8.2, or 8.3 as applicable, then no later than the due diligence deadline or the financing and appraisal deadline, whichever is later, the buyer will, we're doing this as if they will deliver to the buyer's brokerage an additional earnest money deposit in the amount of this. The earnest money deposit and the additional earnest money deposit, if applicable, are sometimes referred to herein as the deposits. The earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, shall be credited towards the purchase price at closing. By the way, I do believe that's the first time that they explicitly state the earnest money deposit shall be credited towards the purchase price at closing. I think I think it's the only time. Scott says, I have tried. That means it was probably unsuccessful. I think is a it's a straightforward concept. So, from a buyer's perspective, it's reasonable to say, listen, I don't want to deposit a whole bunch of earnest money because, you know, I suspect that there's going to be problems during my inspection, or I suspect that there's something, I heard through the grapevine that the seller's disclosures have some problems that I'm willing to look at, but I don't want to put a whole lot of earnest money at risk in order to do that. In this scenario, I think it's appropriate to say, okay, why don't you deposit a smaller amount of earnest money during your due diligence of finance and appraisal conditions, and during that time, we'll give you a cheaper look at this property. But then if you decide to move forward in order to buy this property, you have to deposit more earnest money to keep going, because we want to see some more good faith from you that you have some serious intentions to move forward. Because a lot of people do this, and by the way, like, it's a really good way to get people off the fence, right? So you know that you sort of know if they pass the finance and appraisal deadline, you feel like you got a deal, but that's not a given. So you know that people won't mess around if they also have to deposit more earnest money and more's on the line and they got to write a check or send a wire. Well, tell them not to write a check. We already had this, but they got to send a wire or got to go get a money order. That can push them in the direction maybe we want them to go, right? So don't forget that paragraph. I think it's handy. Nice handy paragraph. All right, moving on. Buyer default and seller default. And then after that, I think we're kind of done with the REPC. Buyer default. If buyer defaults, seller may elect one of the following remedies. A, cancel the REPC and retain the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, as liquidated damages. B, maintain the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, in trust, and sue buyer to specifically enforce the REPC. What? Did I just read that right? Is this wrong? Or am I going crazy? If the buyer defaults, they want to sue buyer to specifically enforce the REPC and return, or C, return the earnest money deposit or deposit, if applicable, to buyer and pursue other remedies available by law. No, it's me. It's not anybody else. It's definitely me. So that's if buyer defaults. Seller default. If seller default, buyer may elect one of the following remedies: cancel the REPC, and in addition to the return of the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, buyer may elect to accept from seller as liquidated damages a sum equal to the earnest money deposit or deposits, if applicable, or B, maintain the earnest money deposit in trust and sue seller to specifically enforce the REPC, or C, accept a return of the earnest money deposit and pursue any other remedies available at law if buyer elects to accept liquidated damages. Seller agrees to pay the liquidated damages to buyer upon demand. So this is kind of an interesting scenario. If you get into a sticky situation, remind either party that if they really want to hire an attorney and pursue damages, they have to leave their earnest money deposit where it's at. They don't get to accept it. They don't get to withdraw it. Here is one question that I will pose to you, Rob. It seems as though the only reason you have to leave your earnest money deposit in its current spot in a trust is if you plan to sue for specific enforcement of the contract. Otherwise, you get it back and you can sue them for any other reason. That seem right?
Well, okay. So if you're going into those remedies, so the first one being that, cancel the REPC, and in addition to return, they keep it. So that obviously isn't going to be returned in that situation because they'll keep the earnest money. The second one, where the maintain the earnest money or the deposits, that's if they're going to sue for performance. So yes, the earnest money would remain with the company. But then yes, the last one, you would have to return the earnest money and then pursue any damages. And it's interesting. There was a case that was, actually, I shared it with our office. It was a lawsuit like in the last 3 years with a commercial property. And it was a transaction where I think it was a hotel that was under contract, and the buyer ultimately ended up canceling after all of their deadlines, and they were going to walk away from the earnest money and just leave it with the seller.
You walk back down there, you open some.
And so what happened is that the property initially went under contract. Let's just say if it went under contract at $2 million, then it went under contract again after the first buyer canceled, and it went under contract for, say, let's just say 1.5. So a $500,000 drop. So the seller was suing the buyer for the damages, the difference from when it was, at 2 million, and then in this case to half 1.5. So they were suing for the $500,000. When it got to, at the end of the day, once they got to the court's decision, the court ruled that the seller, in essence, in this case, the buyer was, they issued their notice of cancellation, and because the seller retained the earnest money, they had already elected the avenue what they were going to pursue for damages. So yes, the buyers lost their earnest money of whatever amount it was. Let's just say it's 50 grand. The seller was able to retain that, but the seller lost the lawsuit in getting their $500,000 loss. So because that retention of the earnest money by the seller, that indicated what they were entitled to. They already chose their remedy.
Yeah. Great answer. Great answer, Rob. Scott asks a really good question. Brokers, when seller default occurs and earnest money is the remedy, how difficult is it to collect the earnest money? I mean, it varies from, this is actually a subject I wanted to talk about. This is Utah law. So if there is a dispute over earnest money and you as the broker give notice, and it's usually you as the seller, right? You represent the seller. If you call the other broker and say, hey, I'm disputing this earnest money, by law, they're just supposed to keep that earnest money in their trust account, and they can't release it until you resolve this dispute.
There's one thing that they can also choose to do. The brokerage can choose to interplead it, which basically turns the earnest money over to the courts and let them decide if they want to remove them from the decision. But in order to interplead it, a brokerage would have to pay the cost to send that money to it. And it's, there is an expense to it. It's not cheap.
Yeah. To answer that though, it really depends. I would say, if they're canceling after their finance and appraisal deadline, and it's just that clear cut, not that bad. I would say it happens the majority of the time. If there's real dispute about it, it usually resolves itself. But I have had instances where maybe a couple in 8 to 10 years where the other brokerage, which was, sort of the broker was the only agent kind of a thing, or maybe there was 2 or 3 other people there. And I think just so they wouldn't make their buyer feel bad, they just released the money after I said, hey, we're disputing that. You owe that money to the seller. A couple days later, they're like, yeah, we released it. And I was pretty hot. And that didn't resolve itself well because it wasn't an amount that pursuing would be worth it, right? You'd spend more money pursuing it than it would be, than you would collect. So I would say, if it's clear cut, not too bad, pretty easy, really. And a lot of the times too, you put, if it's clear cut, the other broker doesn't usually, they're supposed to represent their client, but also, what are you going to do? Lie about the situation? Sometimes it's too easy. But there are some murky situations where you have to, sort of duke it out over emails for a few weeks before anything resolves itself. I would say maybe in my career when I've actually had to go collect earnest money where I was involved, probably successfully happens 90% of the time ish. But I'll also say, like, I see stuff get resolved and earnest money get distributed where I'm not even involved. The agents are just like, they fight over it for a day or two and they send the document that I'll present here in a minute and it's just done. So that happens maybe more than when I get involved personally.
Mike, I'm
yeah.
specifically asking if it's a seller default. And now
Oh.
you know, if you have a buyer's earnest money, it's a whole lot easier to get than
Yeah.
if the seller defaults and you don't have that money and they're like, nope, sue me, I'm not giving it.
Oh, that's a good question. Uh, Man, I don't know how many times I've really dealt with that. Um, it just from memory, the times that I dealt with the seller just saying, you know what, I'm not selling anymore. We usually get some earnest money because the seller's in a position where they know that they don't really have an avenue to not sell, and so they don't want any more problems. Like they want to be done with the situation, and they really like that. I think their perception is they want to buy themselves out of this situation they no longer want to be part of. So they almost, in my limited experience on this, because it doesn't happen a lot, they're trying to get out, so they provide that avenue immediately. It's very rare that they go, nope, no more, catch you later. It happened to me once, and I was the agent on it, and both parties were like, yeah, we don't want to either. I was like, what happened? Like both of them were just like, yeah, we're both done, I want to cancel. And the other person was like, yeah, me too. It was really bizarre. So anyway, yeah, I think the seller, if the seller is just saying no, they usually are like, let's get out of this, here's some money. If we represent them, I always like, I know what the contract says, but we always lead like, hey, if we were to cancel right now and give you half of the earnest money, would you be okay with that? If, not just submit a document, not cancel, but sort of pre-negotiate maybe a lesser amount if we represent a seller or something. We always try that. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it doesn't. But it's not, it's not that difficult. I haven't had, super long negotiations on earnest money on any deal. Maybe a week is the longest I've really ever dealt with. What about you? What about you, Rob?
I unfortunately have had several others where the seller doesn't want to pay anything, and we've tried the avenues where you've tried to say, hey, what's it going to take if we understand that the seller doesn't want to cancel, they change their mind, they don't want to sell the house anymore. We've said, hey, let's try to do some negotiation. If the seller doesn't want to pay the full amount, buyer, will you take half? I've had some where the seller will not pay a single dime. They don't care. They literally have said, come and sue me. And in that situation, that's the only advice you can offer the buyer is understand where you're coming from. The seller, we've instructed the seller with what the terms of the contract are. They've chosen to cancel because they're not going to sell anymore. And the seller, we've instructed the seller that they should be providing matching the earnest money, and they haven't written the check. Whatever happened after that, when it was all said and done, whether the buyer took the party to court or not, I don't have any examples that they did.
Yeah.
But if the seller's not going to pay the check, there's nothing we can do about it.
I only have one experience that's with myself, so I can't really give you any in-depth on this, but my experience, not directly related to earnest money, but just resolving a dispute where people owed money. I took them to small claims and it worked pretty good. You don't get your money right away. Like you have to enforce it when you win in small claims court. I don't know how well it'll work, for earnest money in a purchase contract, but maybe.
Mike, this is an interesting question. Agents ask this all the time, where the contract makes it clear if there's a party that defaults, then these are the consequences for it. And I unfortunately have to tell people, I said, yes, I get the fact that the contract says what's supposed to happen, but doing that and actually getting the money, those are two different avenues. And it's because if parties don't want to comply with what's there, then sometimes the only other avenue is going to court.
Yep. Yeah, and small claims court is accessible to average people, really. It's not, it's not just some easy thing you do, but it's accessible, and you could win. I think the downside is, my experience was, it was clear that the judge really didn't understand real estate or anything related to real estate. And so you could get a judge who really knows real estate, but you might get somebody who's like, what are you talking about? Because they never dealt with real estate law. And it's understandable. Like, you can't know every law for every industry, right? So you might get somebody, and so it'll just be you up there going, listen, it's this reason for this reason. And you got to sort of, you can take an attorney, but it's possible. So we only have 5 minutes left. I want to just go over really quick all the documents related to earnest money, so you know what's available to you and what's possible. So this document you're looking at right now, of course, you've probably seen it, the resolution of earnest money dispute, the mutual release. So this is, you in Scott's situation where you're saying seller, you defaulted, you would use this. And this might be a good document to put forward and get him to sign it, so we can, this is the release of the earnest money. So, sorry. This is when you're disputing it and you come to some term, and then people will sign this in order to resolve the dispute, right? It's a good document. Deposit of earnest money with title company. By the way, this is a really good point of leverage. If people deposit earnest money in a title company and they do not use this document, that's leverage. Just recognize that. And they've also, by the way, are potentially in default of the contract if they deposit and don't declare it. So this is that. There is yeah, go ahead.
Can I clear you up on that a little bit? Because we dealt with this in a pro standard hearing.
Mm-hmm.
An agent did it in a regular addendum to put the earnest money at title. It didn't cause a default, but the agent was fined $500 for not using the UAR form.
Well, that's a good point. Because, if you see it on an addendum, I don't think anybody cares, because you recognize that, they put it in writing where they're going to deposit it. And I think generally that's okay, but you are required to use the forms if there's one available. So that's a good point. Is this our form? I don't think it is. This is a non-refundable earnest money addendum. So this is if people agree that, this is non-refundable, we have a habit of just saying earnest money shall be non-refundable. This is a better language for that. So know that that's available to you. I think we did this addendum. This is a Berkshire addendum, where this was during the crazy times where people were doing, they wanted that earnest money release now. Like, if you're going to accept this deal, we want the earnest money release now. Well, if you are releasing earnest money to a seller and you represent a buyer, you should be using this addendum that we created, because it has good language surrounding how you release it, who you release it to, because there's problems with just like our brokerage cutting a check to a seller who's not our client. Like, it's not clean. This this addendum that you can use, which is the non-refundable and release of earnest money addendum, provides real clear guidance on how it's released, where it's going to, and how soon it's going to happen. So that's a really good tool for you. This is the deposit of earnest money at seller's brokerage. Okay, so this is the addendum you can use. Am I right? Buyer represents buyer. Yeah, so you can use this addendum. So you might have an unrepresented buyer, and they are like, where do I deposit our earnest money? And you represent the seller, and you should deposit it at our brokerage. It's a good place to deposit it instead of the title company. This is the document that you use for that. Even, by the way, you can even do it with other agents who work at brokerages who refuse to manage trust accounts. And this is also a Berkshire specific document. So let's say you have a client and you know that their deal just failed, but they're on the hunt for a brand new property, and you know we can cut them a check, and then they got to go to deposit again, or you can use this form, which is the authorization to transfer or hold earnest money. This is our document. It gives us written permission to just hold their earnest money deposit at our brokerage, or if they put another contract really quickly, we can transfer the earnest money to that contract, and we have prior written authorization to do that. So there you have it, 2 o'clock on the dot. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you got something valuable out of it, and we'll see you next time.
Good job, Mike.
Thanks.